Welcome to the Mystic Fool's Journey podcast. I'm Anna, and this is Ruth.
Howdy.
This is an occult history podcast, and today we are diving into hysteria, witches, and the invention of psychiatry. So let's dive on in.
Let's dive on in. So today, calling someone a witch can be an insult, but also claiming the title of witch can also be super empowering to many. But way back when, the idea of finding empowerment in being called a witch was non-existent. In fact, the rise of the witch is closely tied to the rise of women being diagnosed with hysteria. So how did we get from there to here? Let's find out.
Oh, let's buckle up, kids. This is going to be our ride.
It is a ride for sure. So hysteria goes way back, like ancient Greece back, and they called it hysteria because they believed that it was all about the uterus. Like, seriously, the word comes from hystera, which means uterus in Greek. These Greeks thought women's problems were all tied to their wandering uteruses, causing them to freak out physically and emotionally.
Yeah. I mean, yes. When I first heard about the wandering uterus, I was like, people will just perform like Olympic level mental gymnastics to like avoid treating others with like respect or equality.
It's so true.
I was like, you really just came up with this. So did you read much about the wandering uterus?
No, this is the first time I've ever heard of it, and I could not believe what I was reading.
When you mentioned it, I was like, okay, I do remember learning about this like a long time ago. And then, after, several years of living your life, you just forget certain things. You have other stuff to remember.
Right.
And I was like, all right, we got to touch on the wandering uterus. So there was a Greek physician, I'm not going to say it right, as usual, Aristeas, who wrote that the womb moved around the woman's body. Like, they literally thought it physically would move. And there were other Greek physicians as well, including Hippocrates, that would believe this and subscribe to this and use it to diagnose women. So essentially, they literally thought that the womb would move around the body. And depending on where it was, it would like put pressure on different like organs and things. So they would blame it for anything like headaches to like shortness of breath, because they're like, oh, like your uterus is squeezing your lungs. And this is the thing, they thought that you could entice it back to its normal place by putting like nicely smelling fragrances near the vagina.
What?
Yeah.
That's insane.
Or they would be like, oh no, your uterus has wandered too far up. Like if it's like near your head, they'd make you sniff things that smelled bad to like scare it away. It's like, think like spraying a cat with water. They're like,
oh my God.
They're like, no, get out of here. Uterus, go back to your, they would just like, that's how they treat you. Is they're just like, here, like put like these nice smelling fragrances in between your legs. Like just like air it out and it'll be drawn back to its normal place.
I mean, truly, what is going on?
They're just like, well, I don't get it. Like, I don't understand their physiology. So clearly, it must be this thing, this one thing that our bodies don't have that they have that's causing all the problems.
And like, what did they think it looked like in there? I'm just like imagining like an octopus moving and like squeezing and, forming to whatever shape it is. That's so weird.
Yeah, it's weird and gross and clearly wrong.
Yeah, clearly wrong.
They clearly weren't like treating anything real either. When you think about it, like, so you're just like, these people probably had real physical issues and you're like, it's just your uterus, sweetheart. We'll just like surround yourself with perfume and you'll be fine. And you're like,
that's so funny. Man, so in the Middle Ages, hysteria was all about the ladies, but this time it was often blamed on their morals and spirituality. Fainting, mood swings, and anxiety were seen as proof that women were emotionally shaky and morally weak.
I'm saying it out loud. You're just like, wow, that's ridiculous.
I know. It's so ridiculous. I feel so sad. So the church, especially the Catholic Church during the Middle Ages, had a huge say in how like people saw and dealt with hysteria. And they thought that women's suffering had to do with their original sin or even possession by evil spirits. And they saw hysteria as a result of women being morally and spiritually fragile. So fun.
Oh man, it's just I keep going. It's just rough.
Yeah, we're just gonna rein it back. We're gonna rein it back for a few paragraphs.
Just keep
When
going.
women had hysterical symptoms, the church prescribed things like religious rituals and exorcisms. They believed these rituals would chase away the evil spirits behind the symptoms, and the church felt women were more vulnerable to demonic influence because of their supposed moral weaknesses.
It just feels like it feels like humanity has a history of being afraid of emotions, especially from women. Like, no, we can't have negative emotions. We can't even like express excitability. Even like you can't be like too excited because you might be crazy. Because that, I feel like emotions are a key thing in humans that point to when something is going wrong, whether that's in society, in a relationship, whatever it is. And it's just kind of like, no, we don't want to deal with that. Like, we're scared of change. We like the way things are, so don't be emotional. Like, they're basically just like, could you just be a piece of furniture in society? That would be great. Like, just produce babies and be quiet.
Exactly. Yeah. And obvious statement, but if emotions were useless, we wouldn't have evolved to have them.
Right. Exactly. You're like, there are some very useful reasons we have emotions. Oh my God, that could be its own whole episode.
I know, truly.
But yes, like there's a reason we have them and we feel things. So maybe don't ignore them. That goes really bad. Like therapy will help you through that. Like, don't ignore them. Sure. That's a thing that's real bad for all of us.
For sure. Feel your feelings. Mm-hmm. So anyways, during the Middle Ages, witches and hysteria were mixed up in the culture's religious and social beliefs. Accusations of witchcraft often came from the fear and superstitions of the time, linking hysteria symptoms to witchcraft and causing just like a ton of trouble. They even accused so-called witches of like some super bizarre stuff, like making men impotent and hiding their dicks in a tree nest. So I know that you're probably going to want to know more about the penis trees, so here's the lowdown.
Oh my God.
So the famous account of this kind of stuff can be found in the Malleus Maleficarum, pronunciation unknown, which is, it's basically like a witch hunting manual from the 15th century, and it was written by a guy named Heinrich Kramer. Now, most historians think it's a pretty absurd and sexist text. Texas sex. That's what I said.
I mean, why not?
So anyways, most historians think it's a pretty absurd and Texas sex. I can't say the words.
It's a Texas sex. It's a Texas sex.
It's a sexist text. Okay. But sadly, it led to a whole lot of women being wrongly accused of witchcraft and some pretty awful things happening. This guy, Francis Hill, in the Salem Witch Trials Reader, even calls it one of the scariest and most awful books ever written. Yeah, it's sad. Okay, moving on. It talks about witches supposedly keeping disembodied penises as pets and feeding them like they're little animals. So imagine witches gathering up like a bunch of these things, like 20 or 30 at a time, and locking them up in a bird's nest or like just some box. And get this, they claim that these detached penises move around like they're still alive, chowing down on oats and stuff. People back then really believed this, and it was a hot topic of conversation.
Wow, we've come so far.
Wandering uteruses to penis trees.
To penis trees. Yeah. So if you've ever seen the animated show Big Mouth, when you're saying this, like, there's literally these animated tiny penises that they basically treat like puppies, right? Just like feed them and water them. So that was what came to mind. Still horrifying because this was not like in a funny context back then.
Yes.
But there's actually art of these phallus trees. It is a little bit undecided, actually, whether or not the artworks are specifically about this witchcraft side, or whether it was just more of like hey, this was a big symbol of fertility. So there's some arguments back and forth about like when you see the penis trees, because apparently they're in lots of manuscripts, and there is a giant mural of a penis tree in Italy.
What?
Yes, you can look it up. You can look it up. It's ridiculous, but it's this giant tree with penises on it, and there's like several people below it. They're each doing different things. Like there's 2 people putting a penis in a bag, and then there's like another 2 people looking at a penis and like poking at it with a stick.
Oh my god.
And then it looks like there's like, I think there's like 4 women like arguing over penises. I don't know. But there's
That's
this
so funny.
mural, and it's in the Palace of Abundance, which is like this 3-story building in this particular city where they would house grain, and it was connected to aqueducts. So there's some argument that it's like, oh, the penis tree is a symbol of fertility because it was placed in this building that is known for like having all the harvest and the water and abundance. But it was still, it was like created during this time. So there's still other theories that are like, no, this is like proof of penis trees and witchcraft.
Oh my god. That's crazy.
It's wild. And yeah, the book is pretty awful. It recommends things like torture and deception to like get confessions out of witches. And this dude basically wrote it, like he was an inquisitor, but he also, Heinrich basically wrote it because he took people to trial initially, and then they were all acquitted. Like no one got like arrested or charged. Like these women were actually released, and he basically was like his vengeance manual. Like he was just
oh
like,
my god.
it was kind of like, everything I was reading about it just kind of seemed like, oh man, he got destroyed in court, and now he's gonna write this manual and like stick it to him. And
Whoa. I mean, honestly, what was going on back then? Like, why do all these people just get a better hobby?
I know. I was like, could you do like pick up woodworking? Have you tried pottery? Like whittling?
Yeah.
Some cooking?
Like, there's just no way back then where you had to like physically use your body every day to survive. They had time for all of this. It's crazy.
Right? I was just, like,
Whatever.
come on, guys. Yeah. Oh, some guy's ego got hurt, and then he ended up helping other people murder a bunch of women. This is basically that's what I got out of this story.
Okay, but a little bit more on the penis trees, just real quick. So the guy, Kramer, tells the story about this dude who lost his manhood and was desperate to try to get it back. So he went to see a witch who told him to climb up a specific tree where he'd find a nest with a lot of these things inside, and he could supposedly pick any one he liked. But the poor guy got turned down when he went for a big one because apparently it belonged to a parish priest. Isn't that crazy?
Wow, you're like, yeah, you can't have this one because it's for the dude that leads the church. He needs it.
I know, right? Anyways, I just thought, like, if we're going to spend the majority of this episode talking about women's anatomy, we could talk about men's anatomy for a second.
Yeah.
To kind of even the balance.
There's going to be a lot more women's anatomy coming up.
Yeah. So they believed that the evil spirits were the one causing all of these, like, issues. But the so-called treatment for bewitchment led to the death of, like, thousands of women, so not cool.
Sounds like the men are acting pretty hysterical, if you ask me.
Whoa! Snaps there.
Now who's emotional?
Right? Owned. They're never coming back from that.
Yeah, I'm sure they feel real bad about it.
So in a groundbreaking book from 1973 called Witches, Midwives, and Nurses, Barbara Heinrich and Renrich... We're just going to roll with it. And Deidre English. I'm so sorry, Barbara, but I've only read it. I've never said it out loud, so I don't know.
I understand.
So they argue that the first witchcraft accusations in Europe were basically the result of male doctors associated with the church getting worried about losing business to female healers.
Capitalism strikes again.
Surely.
I mean, it wouldn't surprise me if that was that seems to be like a very common thing when women started to like have any kind of autonomy or encroach on a field that men had previously dominated. There's always pushback.
For sure.
It's hard to ignore that pattern.
Yeah, absolutely. That's for sure. But one other crucial aspect that helped turn witches into feminist icons is the newly created discipline of psychiatry. And for this section, we're going to travel back in time to France. So in France, there was always some tension between psychiatry and the church. You see, like, the church used to be like the go-to place for sorting out your soul. And nuns were kind of like the OG caregivers for folks who weren't all there mentally. And the clergy were the healers, obviously. Women do the work and men get to come in and save the day. But here comes psychiatry, and it's gobbling up their turf. It's like moving in on the church's soul-saving and the nuns' care game. So things got pretty awkward in the rivalry between them.
Yeah, when you start to think about the history of really any spirituality, religion, sacred rituals, whether it's cultural or religious or both, most cultures had kind of what I'm going to call proto-sciences. So healers and herbalists were the predecessors to doctors. Like, we now know that there were like lots of reasons why the herbs used actually did things that weren't good for the humans that were using them. There were rituals that would be performed to purify someone or like cleanse the whole community or release negative or unwanted spirits or energies. It's going to be specific to each culture, but these are kind of like predecessors to therapy. When you start to think about it, like, it all used to be very intertwined, like they were all one and the same, like healing and therapy and mental health were also intertwined with your spirituality and religion and culture.
Yeah.
So now that we're getting like the sciences coming about, everything's starting to kind of be pulled apart, and you start to see like, okay, as things evolve and the modernization of religions is happening, confessing sins to a priest was the closest thing people used to have to therapy before psychology made its debut and it started to be taken seriously as an actual science and a practice in psychiatry. So, we can kind of start to see like the splintering of spirituality and what use it has to people as science comes about and is like, oh, but we can actually like now explain herbs and medicine. We can now explain psychology and therapy. So you start to like, you're like, what's left of the spirituality pie is really the question.
Right, exactly.
Science like starts taking these things and evolving them.
It's a good metaphor. What's left of the spirituality pie?
What's left?
Anna, that is
that it?
Some bars.
Oh boy. Yeah. Next on episode, we're going to have slam poetry about spirituality pie.
Spirituality pie. Spirituality pie for the soul. Chicken soup. So anyways, suddenly here were these new scientific explanations for what was going on with people who weren't quite right in the head. But here's the kicker. These explanations didn't just challenge the church on a regular level. They shook things up on a whole nother, like, philosophical level. The spirituality pie. What's left of it? It was like a real thorn in the church's side, and some medical folks were loving it. Some folks may have even picked the topic of studying hysteria because they thought that it could be used as a way to challenge or criticize the clergy. Kind of like an anti-clerical propaganda sort of thing.
That's super interesting.
Yeah, it is, isn't it? It's I wanted to know a little bit more about it, but we don't have quite the time to dive into it, but it's cool.
Maybe some other time? Or we'll just speculate. I'll speculate wildly on it in a moment.
Yeah, there we go. There we go.
Let's just do that.
If it were not for speculating wildly on things, we wouldn't have a podcast.
Yeah, exactly.
So, in fact, some of these medical minds might have picked this whole topic of hysteria as a way to stick it to the church. They figured that since, like, the laws of hysteria were supposed to be universal, they could be used to explain stuff in history, too. So psychiatrists started researching witches specifically as a way to deal a blow to the church. Like, they said that, like, demonic possession and mystical ecstasies were just part of a big hysterical episode, like in the psychiatrical sense, you know?
Oh my God.
Like arms and legs flailing, tongues hanging out, eyes going all over the place, the whole shebang. It was like they were trying to prove that even things the priests thought were about possession were really just part of the same hysterical show.
Yeah, I was really hoping that they were going to, like, find out that women were being oppressed and that there was, like, I don't know, pushback on how their behavior was actually, like, normal from a psychological standpoint or justified. But no, it's fine. It sounds like psychiatrists were just mostly trying to, like, debunk spirituality, and women were caught in the crossfire once again.
Yeah, it's crazy. Like, yeah, and you can kind of see this kind of pattern through, like, a lot of, like, mental health in, like, not industries, but, like, diagnoses. Like,
oh yeah,
a whole other episode. But, like, there was this crazy little, like, tangent I went off on where it was like black men getting cornered into like schizophrenia, and it was considered like a black men only disease. It was very sad.
That's so wild. Yeah, you're basically, it's like anything to like continually other someone. It's so strange how we like will use, first it's religion, but then with the advent of sciences, it's like we then started to use medical sciences to other women, minorities. Kind of like with this, like hysteria was typically just like almost always a female only thing, or it was blamed on the uterus. Like, here's another way to separate ourselves from this different type of human, even though it's like we're really not that terribly different. Like, we should, it's gonna be better off if we stop acting like that.
Yeah, and it's layered too. Like, at this point in the episode, it's like, cool, I'm glad that doctors are kind of like, you know, making this a science and kind of, you know, getting more context from a scientific basis of like why women might act this way. You know, it's not like the church's view of like it's just because we're sinning. You know, they're widening our viewpoint of what hysteria is. But you'll see pretty quickly here that like it gets pigeonholed even further. Like, it's not, it can't just be this pure thing of like, you know, letting women be free and like hysteria being this diagnosis or whatever. Like, they take it a step farther and they use it to pigeonhole, you know, women even further. It's just an unfortunate little cycle that goes on.
Super unfortunate, because that means there's people who probably did have real mental disorders and everything was just being lumped under one thing simply because they were a woman. Just like with like the schizophrenia and black men. You're like, oh, it's just schizophrenia. And you're like, cool. You know, there's a lot more nuances to what someone could be experiencing right now.
Yeah, exactly. So there's these guys like Jean-Martin Charcot who ran a clinic in Paris, and they were all about this sort of thing. Charcot and his buddy Paul Richer got into some pretty interesting stuff in their book, The Possessed in Art. It was published in like 1887. And they basically went through old paintings and artworks that showed people being possessed by demons and argued that the weird positions these folks were in meant that they were actually just hysterics.
Huh. Okay, they're like,
as opposed to possession.
Yeah, they're trying to like retroactively like correct the record, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. And so then another one of Charcot's assistants, Paul Regnard, wrote a book called Epidemic Maladies. Geez, these freaking big words. Can we just keep all of the words to like a third grade reading level, please?
I think that'll work. We can try. We should do a whole podcast where we just use third grade reading level.
Exactly. So anyways, he wrote a book called Epidemic Maladies of the Spirit, Witchcraft, Magnetism, Morphinism, and Megalomania.
Okay, they made that hard on purpose.
I know, right? It's gotta be. They just want to embarrass me. I know it. So that was in 1887. In it, he claimed that witches and hysterics had a lot in common. For instance, he said witches would do those like typical hysterical poses with their backs all arched. And according to him, witches and hysterics were like two peas in a pod. You know, not people who claimed themselves to be witches, but people who were labeled as witches.
So they were basically going back and saying like, hey, from a quote unquote scientific perspective, witches were actually just mentally ill. That's what I'm hearing.
Exactly.
Yeah. They're like, witches don't exist because we're scientists and we don't believe in that. So clearly these are all just mentally ill people that were mislabeled as witches.
Exactly. And people and women who weren't claiming the title of witch back then, you know. They were given the title as like a way to ostracize. So anyways, Charcot was a showman, no doubt about it.
Oh boy.
Yeah, this is where it takes a turn into like, you couldn't just let this whole thing be what it was, and like he just had to take it a step further into like the unfortunate. So he'd have these open lectures on Tuesdays, and he'd put on a real spectacle. He'd trigger hysterical attacks using hypnosis or by poking certain hysterogenic points. I'm not a doctor here, but I don't know about that. And then he'd narrate what the patients were going through. Obviously, this is like exploitation and inaccurate medicine and not cool. Just to preface, this guy is obviously like a con man at minimum.
Oh God. So yeah, I read a little bit about this. So before we get into some of the other stuff he did, weirder stuff that he did, Charcot did make significant contributions to documentation and study of neurological disorders like ALS, multiple sclerosis, and Parkinson's disease. And this is the one thing I'm going to give, aside from that, one thing I'm going to give him credit for. He also, unlike his peers at the time, argued that hysteria was not a female-only issue. So at the very least, we got one guy trying.
Yeah, for sure.
He's not doing everything right. I think that's important to know that most people aren't ever going to do everything right. But he did.
Right.
He thought that his hypothesis was that everyone can experience it, and it's caused by some sort of trauma or heavy experiences, like men going off to war could experience it as well. So it's not like this was his only shtick. It's not like this was his only deal. He did do other things. I think it's just important to point out that while he was really wrong about a lot of things in this particular arena, he did do other things right, like most people do, the duality of life. But okay, and last thing before we get into this, I think it's important to know why it got weird here for Charcot. So he was a neurologist, not a psychiatrist.
Right.
So he diagnosed and would document nervous system diseases from a physical standpoint. We think that the reason you have Parkinson's disease is this particular nerve set is being affected and that's causing the shaking or things like that. So he's very much looking at the body from a physical standpoint and how the nervous system and damage to it causes physical symptoms to show up.
Sure.
The part and why it starts to get weird around hysteria is that he was trying to link the physical with the psychological, and he was not a psychologist. So his initial hypothesis was he thought hysteria was a neurological disorder, not a psychological one. And so that's when he starts to go into a territory that he was not trained to go into. And that's why it starts to get really weird when he gets into his hysteria treatments.
Yeah, those are some pretty important distinctions. Thanks for clarifying.
So what else did he do in these theatrical hysteria?
Okay, and also to say, he's not doing these medical theatrics was very common at the time. It was, for some reason, doctors thought it was fine to do. It wasn't.
It's totally fine. Just come watch, watch me treat this patient. So now you're on stand as the patient. Do I need to perform? What do I need to do?
Yeah, so they do all sorts of crazy stuff with these things, like sticking needles into cataleptic patients or putting lethargic folks into these gravity defying postures. It was literally a magic show, and everyone came to watch. Authors, actors, and even tourists. And they made the Psychiatry. I don't know how to say it. That was really terrible.
No,
hospital. I don't mean, I'm not making fun of it. I just, Salpêtrière. It's a Salpêtrière hospital.
I'll go with that. I did not take French in high school.
No.
I can't help with that pronunciation.
Yeah. So it made this hospital a very popular attraction in Paris, which is, not cool. Even, for one thing, it's okay, if it's just doctors coming to watch and learn, that's one thing, but now it was anybody and everybody, Joe Schmo off the street could come and watch these people who were clearly going through something mentally. They were really put on a show, and that's very unfortunate.
And now we have TV.
Yeah, now we just have TV reality shows. It's fine.
Oh, man.
Oh, that's a sad distinction.
I mean, that's kind of what was happening. We're bored today. Let's go watch the local hysteric get poked.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. Oh, and they also did some experiments where they'd write stuff on patients' skin and it would leave raised marks for a really long time. And they often chose spooky words like Satan, probably because they thought that there was a connection between witchcraft and hysteria at the time. And so when Charcot talked about hysteria, it had kind of the supernatural and spooky vibe to it. He used a lot of religious and demon-related terms, which is kind of ironic because he was trying to prove that there was nothing demonic about it.
Yeah.
It's just weird.
That's weird.
He got lost in the sauce.
Definitely.
His personal style was also pretty goth. His office was all black and had creepy pictures of people possessed by demons hanging on the walls, which sounds like a vibe.
The first emo in science.
But here's the fun part. Sometimes Charcot would ditch the whole science thing and go for just straight dramatic performances. During his lectures, he'd do this trick where he'd tell a hysterical patient that a card from a blank deck had a picture on it. He'd mark the card secretly, shuffle the deck, and the patient would magically pick the right one. Some women who saw this started thinking that they had supernatural powers, like extrasensory perception, and started seeing themselves as modern-day witches with supernatural abilities. So his patients started, like, leaning into it as well.
So gaslighting. Yeah, I was going to say, like, they started to play it up. I mean, like...
gaslighting, and also, like, what other, like, opportunities did people suffering from these sorts of things actually have, you know?
Right, exactly. That's unfortunate, too. The whole, like,
right.
you're very likely, like, cannot support yourself because of this issue you have. And now it's like, well, here's a way that, like, I'm getting attention and I'm getting validation for this. Let me play into it.
Exactly. So, and get this, the way they diagnosed a hysterical person was surprisingly similar to how they used to identify witches back in the old days. They'd strip the person naked and poke them with pins to find spots where they couldn't feel pain.
Ugh, that does feel like something that has been around in medicine for a while, minus the hysterics part. Like, I swear, like, you know, being, like, just generally, like, poked and tapped to make sure your nerves work is a thing.
Yeah, acupuncture.
And, like, you're just like... I guess is this kind of like where it first started?
Yeah, for sure. Well, I think it's probably been, I'm sure there's a long and rich history, but acupuncture is used for so many things.
Oh,
like, I got diagnosed with allergies as a kid using acupuncture.
Oh, wild.
Yeah, it was weird. Yeah. So anyways, Charcot's science of hysteria provided a fresh dose of ancient ideas about women, mystery, and demons. It's like he mixed science with, like, a dash of spookiness. And this whole view of women as mysterious and kind of spooky, well, it spread across Europe and influenced other medical folks too.
I have to interject here because it also influenced some medical devices. I'm going to put that in heavy quotes too.
Nice.
So doctors originally would prescribe and perform pelvic massages by hand.
God.
Yeah, it gets rough. To reduce symptoms of hysteria.
Wow.
Yeah. And for some context, science and doctors had not caught on to the fact that hand jobs was sexual in any way. Like, they genuinely, they genuinely thought that only penetration was sexually pleasing for women. So this was like, yes. So from their perspective, this was purely like, when we say trying to find the clit, it like medicine did not link clitoris with sexual pleasure at this point in time. They just thought it was a very clinical thing. They literally thought women could only, like, get off with full penetration. So
wow.
So, like, that's where this, like, started. We have, like, okay, you're being prescribed pelvic massages, but get this, a lot of people were getting diagnosed with hysteria, and it was a kind of a tedious process for doctors, and sometimes doctors would, like, pass it off to midwives to do instead.
What?
Yes. So sometimes like midwives and doctors would be the ones performing basically hand jobs to cure or, like, treat hysteria. And since it wasn't so quick, it wasn't a quick job, along comes a man named George Taylor in 1869, and he was a physician who patented one of the first medical vibrators. It was steam powered, by the way.
What?
It was like from what I hear, from what I've read, I didn't find photos. I don't know if it was even possible, or, like, drawings, but apparently it was huge. Like, you could only find them in spas or, like, medical spas at the time. It was also built, you know, he said, to help treat other things like arthritis and muscle pain. But it was very often now the go-to for treating hysteria, and that's where we get the modern vibrator, is because they started to develop smaller. They started to develop, once electricity came around, smaller and smaller versions, and they started to be marketed as, like, at-home treatments for hysteria, like ones that you could take home once electricity was widely available. So now we have vibrators.
Man, I just have so many thoughts.
I know. I'm like, I can't, like, I'm glad we've got them, but also, is this the history I want out of that?
I know, truly. It's so sad how so many things in our culture is birthed out of that. Also, steam powered. So like a tiny train, like chugging this thing around.
It's like, I guess like I have no idea. I did not deep dive into like how that was set up, but like it was very large. Like I think it like took up a room type situation because,
I'm sure.
coal and steam and
It's just crazy how like I just don't understand how we get to these points where like we don't listen to women or minorities at all. And like
yeah,
the
we're just
old
like,
days,
okay,
like
cool.
it's just like, man, it seems like just so wild set of circumstances for sure.
Yeah, when you say it out loud now, you're like, this seems insane. Like if someone like
Yeah,
did any
so
of this
easily
now,
disprovable.
right? Wild. Here we are.
Here we are. So, you know what's interesting? Back in the day, doctors linked hysteria and some other like nerve problems in women to not just old witches, but also to the fact that women were starting to chase new job and education opportunities.
Classic.
Yeah, and it wasn't just the medical folks making this connection. Critics of the feminist movement also tied hysteria to organized feminism. They basically said, hey, these women wanting more rights and stuff are driving themselves hysterical.
Yes, of course we are. If the pattern isn't obvious by now to anybody or our listeners or people who just pay attention to history, basically anytime women or minorities wanted equality, wanted some like the same opportunities as men, spoke or acted in ways that men thought only men should get to speak or act, they would just call them hysterical. So like, oh, you want to study science? Ha, hysterical. You want to vote? Hysterical. You want to enjoy your life? Hysterical. You want like actual medical treatment? No, you just have hysteria. Like it's just it's just like, oh, here it is. And also if men like just didn't want to deal with women or take the time to figure out what they were experiencing, they would just blame it on hysteria. So like the list of symptoms is wildly long for hysteria, and it could be anything from nausea to mood swings to fainting to things like seizures and muscle spasms and amnesia and blindness, like actual medical issues. Like it wasn't just, hey, you've got mood swings and you're like being emotional. It's like, no, this woman might have actually had some other form of like serious either mental or physical disability, and they were just like, let's just hand wave it. It's just hysteria. It's all hysteria.
It's so crazy. I mean, like to some extent I understand that like the viewpoint we are from here is like we have MRI machines and we can, track brain waves and that sort of thing. So I understand why like there might have been so wide of like a catch-all thing for this, but at the same time, like what's the deal? Like all of this is easily disprovable if you were just to like listen to women's experiences and, take seriously what was going on in their lives at the time.
Yeah. I think what's also upsetting is that it's like you didn't have really like while medicine had not come as far as we are today, obviously. So it's not like the men were getting more they were getting more specific treatment, but it's not like they had like more diagnoses. It was just kind of like there wasn't really this catch-all for a man who was having this issue. Like doctors would be like, are you having seizures? And they'd probably try and find some way to treat the seizure rather than just blaming it on hysteria.
Right.
It's kind of like, we were being like overlooked wildly. It's like where you're just like, you wouldn't treat a man that way if he walked in and was like, hey, I'm fainting a lot. You'd be like, oh my gosh, there must like, let's fix your diet. Let's do some other weird medical thing at the time. Whereas like with women, it was just like, it's just hysteria.
I do feel like we should bring back the prescription of going to the sea.
Oh, I think that is a valid one. I think that's just humans need to go back to nature as a whole. I just want like a doctor's note so I can send it to my employer and be like, well, I can't. The doctor told me to go. The doctor told me to get fresh air at the ocean. I have to leave.
Exactly.
It's covered by healthcare now. Thank you.
Exactly. So here's where things get even more tangled. Those who were against women's suffrage, the anti-feminists, weren't holding back. They not only called suffragettes hysterical, but also started comparing them to witches. So there was this whole mix-up between hysteria, feminism, and witchcraft in people's discussions now.
And you can learn a little bit more about that in our episodes on satanic feminism.
Whoop, whoop. Gotta get that plug.
Gotta plug our own shit during our shit.
So for instance, there were some funny German cartoons that showed women riding bicycles, which was seen as a symbol of female empowerment at the time because they had to wear pants instead of skirts to ride the bikes. But in these cartoons, they were basically saying that riding a bike was just a modern version of witches riding broomsticks to their gatherings.
Oh my God.
I know. And as a natural consequence, we start to see many of the members of the suffrage movement start to reclaim the term witch.
Yeah. We did talk a little bit about reclaiming that term witch in the satanic feminism episodes as well.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, with that whole like reinterpretation, which I appreciate. Obviously, like now it's been even more like taken back. Seems like more people are like down with it because it's like, hey, we've come a long way socially and in education and science. So we're gonna take it back and make it sick again.
Yeah, let's make it sick again.
Make it sick again.
So with witches becoming pretty closely associated with the suffrage movement, we can finally see the rise of the name witch turn towards a term of empowerment and a symbol of resistance.
It was a long journey to get here.
It was a long journey.
It was a long journey to get there. We're here though. At least we're living in this time, I guess, and not making a podcast about how we're still being, diagnosed with hysteria.
We live in a lucky time.
I feel like in doing this podcast so far, because it's like now that I'm like focused, I feel like when I was in school, like focusing on history, it was like I got to get the grade to pass, and it wasn't like let me connect the dots and see the patterns throughout history.
Right.
So in doing this podcast so far, the pattern that I consistently see is that unfortunately, men have for a very long time been taught and socialized to believe that one of their main sources of value as individuals is derived from power over others.
Yeah.
And they're rarely, if ever, taught to derive their worth like from within themselves, from their own values, or to believe that they have inherent worth, which I don't think honestly anyone is taught that. I think we're all kind of taught to like define who we are in relation to external people or society.
Absolutely.
Rather than like deriving it from within ourselves. So now we get all these events of like power struggles of like varying scales, whether that's like a husband's power over his kids and wife, or a king's power over his people, or in this case, just like men as a whole not understanding women and needing to place themselves above women in that social hierarchy. And it's all just like, it's all an effort to find like purpose and self-worth.
Yeah, I know. Isn't it so sad?
It's really sad. And like women and everyone else have like their own unique versions of this, but because of like the vast power struggles and how much bad shit has happened because of like this particular version of finding your purpose, it's just like, whoa. I'm really glad therapy exists now and everyone should get it.
I know. It should be like a mandatory 2 years from the adulthood.
I know, right? I dream of the day when everyone like is born and just has a therapist available to them for free. And you're just like, here you go. We're all going to fuck up, but we don't have to do it as badly anymore.
Absolutely.
Yeah. It's just kind of like sad to look like, wow, this is really like people just constantly trying to define who they are and find like some sort of worth and place in society, and it's just very misguided and dangerous if you're not taught how to do that in a healthy, constructive way.
I know. Yeah, that is one thing that is nice about our modern society, where we have like so much exposure to other people and how they, from our point of view, look outside looking in, derive their self-worth and that sort of thing, and have started to rethink a lot of these terms and that sort of thing. We've definitely come a long way as a society.
Yes, I'm real glad we don't live in the times when we would just be sent off to get a weird forced hand job because of hysteria.
Right? I know.
Yeah. Oof.
The good news is we would have died young.
That's true. I probably would have died in childbirth or scarlet fever would have got me. Let's be honest.
Yeah.
The likelihood of me living that long, wild.
Yeah.
Well, on that note, this was a horrifying, this is a horrifying dive into hysteria. At its best, it was a catch-all term men used to hand-wave women's needs and health. At its worst, it was used to justify torturing and killing women who expressed normal autonomy. That's what I got out of this.
And that's the way the cookie crumbles.
That's the way the cookie crumbles.
Well, hey, if don't forget to subscribe.
Oh yeah, don't do that. Don't forget. That's important.
And leave a review. If you're a fan of the podcast, we need you to do this so we can find new fans. We want some hysterical fans. We need them.
We're here to support hysterics.
Tell your friends, follow us on all socials. Our handles are Sweet Death Inc. and Mystic Fool Tarot on all platforms. See you later.